Good morning. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So, I don't know if you're aware, but there's a lot happening in the world at the moment, and there's a lot happening spiritually as well. And we also came through a very significant time period now in Father's calendar. So we came through Pesach, and we've gone through the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and they are extremely significant spiritually. And at this time, Father is calling us into alignment. And one thing that we touched on just before we came into Pesach is we asked the question essentially, every year when Pesach approaches, we search inwardly, we look at ourselves and we prepare our hearts. And then Pesach arrives, unleavened bread arrives, and we go through that, and we almost every year come back to the point where we realize there's many of these things that we dealt with that are still with us, that we still need to grow so much and come into alignment. And so this morning, I really want to touch on the antidote to sin and death. This thing that we keep carrying with us. This morning we sang a song, Father, change my heart. So He is the potter, we are the clay. He changes us. He is the one that does that work. So I also want to touch on the difference between Yeshua sacrifice and animal sacrifice. So in this, there's actually so much that we can say, and I'm going to try and get through this quickly because I'm actually wanting to speak about the last slide. So, how things go sometimes. I've been preparing for the sermon and writing things down, all your notes, and I felt I was ready. I've got everything prepared and planned and prayed through and thought through and checked and all those things. And then last night, so we'll see. I went and made changes and took things out and put things in. So may Father's Spirit lead us and guide us, and we'll see what happens. But it might be, and I'm saying this, it might be because there might be a slide that we come to, and it's one of those that I felt may need to be skipped. So bear with me as we go through this. So before we get started, I think it's important to speak about some terminologies. So this is not the topic of today's discussion. It's just to lay a bit of an understanding before we get started, actually. So what is the difference between tragedy and evil? So tragedy is a very complicated idea, and one can get really philosophical about this, but that is not what I want to do. I just want to quickly show something. So I would say maybe a summary or one perspective of how you could see tragedy is that events beyond human influence, so not our will, not our actions, something beyond our influence. For example, an earthquake that causes a brick to fall and to kill someone, that is a tragedy. Sin and evil is maybe something where our consciousness, our will, our choices come into play. And we pick up a brick to kill someone. So the tool is the same, the brick. The effect is the same, killing. But there is a difference between tragedy and evil. Okay. Now, again, this point, maybe I'm going to try and get through this quickly because it can get a bit philosophical, but essentially what I want to highlight is a condition for us to live in this life in some way requires the possibility of tragedy to take place. Now, it sounds strange, but what I mean with this is, if I tried, for example, if I looked at my children and I don't want any tragedy to befall them, as a father, I want to protect them and I want to make sure that no tragedy could touch them. So I might go and equip them with armor, that is impenetrable. They can't be hurt by arrows or bullets or people's words. I have some filter that I put around them that when they hear words and it's negative, that some kind of artificial intelligence maybe translates this language and makes a positive speech to them. Now I could build all these things and put that around my children, but if I put this armor, this shell around my children, somehow I would lose something very precious to me. They would lose essentially some of their humanity, So something about, and again, I say this could be a very deep conversation, But I just wanted to highlight that for us to live in this life, it seems that our will, our choices, bad things, all these things are somehow flowing together for us to have the ability to love, to choose to love, to grow, to mature, and it is necessary, it seems. Father has made it that way. Now, so that was essentially just before we get started. Now, what I want to quickly speak about today is, in this Torah portion for this week is focused on the Day of Atonement, so Yom Kippur, and the process, the rituals, the sacrifices, and all those things. That is the Torah portion for today. But in that, I found something interesting that just jumped out at me, and that is when the blood of the bull atones for the priest, and the ram, and for the people. The blood atones for the sins of the people. And so you've got the two goats, and there's all these rituals. But somewhere it says in there, between all these verses, it says, and there's also atonement made for the tabernacle and the altar. Now the altar and the tabernacle are inanimate objects. They don't sin, they don't choose, they don't have a will, they are inanimate objects, they are part of creation essentially, but they are made for a purpose. They are set apart, they are holy. So they are kadosh. They are set apart for a purpose, and that is to serve the Almighty, to almost, not serve the Almighty, to establish or what is the right word that I'm looking for? To be used in His worship. So, when the sin of the people are atoned for, we see that for some reason and somehow the tabernacle and the altar also needs to be atoned for. So it's as if the sin of the people, in quotes, infects or multiplied to the altar and to the tabernacle. Okay. Now we see in Romans 5 verse 12 that sin entered into the world through the sin of mankind. And because of the sin that entered into the world, death also entered along with it, because we know the wages of sin is death. So sin effectively leads or results in death. So the thing that is interesting is, this one sin of mankind did not only affect themselves, it affected the innocent as well. So sin doesn't only affect the guilty, it affects the innocent. And an example of that would be with Adam and Eve, where an animal was killed. The hide of the animal was used as clothing for them, and God was the one that did that. So an innocent animal was affected by the sin of mankind. So, in other words, sin affects others and creation. Now, also another principle is that leaven multiplies. We know this. So we know the principle of leaven. But there's the leaven is simply an analogy. Leaven is not a bad thing in itself. It's an analogy. It means to point to something. It speaks of something spiritual. Because there's also heavenly leaven. And so we'll be speaking about heavenly leaven as well. So leaven is just a symbol of saying that sin is very much like leaven, in the way that leaven, a little bit of leaven, can spread and multiply in the whole lump, effectively changing this whole lump to be full of leaven. Now that is an analogy of sin, but there's another leaven as well, and that is a heavenly leaven. We'll speak about that. Now, another aspect that I quickly want to highlight is that sin also behaves in many ways like a disease. It multiplies and it can cause death. So the thing with this is that it is not infectious by some kind of sinful sneeze or some kind of a touch. You can't touch someone and then they become sinful. If you are sinful and you touch someone else, you don't transfer your sin that way. It's not infectious like that. But we are somehow able to spread our sin through, it seems like our flesh has some kind of a tendency to like and enjoy, sin, or it gets some kind of short-term or even long-term reward for sin. And so there's something in there that then affects others around us. So we can lead others into sin as well. So there's that concept of how sin can spread, very much like leaven spreads through a lump. So we know this. Now, the question then might be, is there a cure or an antidote for this? So we see in Leviticus, this week's Torah portion, it says there that the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before Yahweh to make atonement over it. So in other words, these two goats, there's a lot that's cast, and the one is sent into the wilderness, the other one is slain. But the one that is sent into the wilderness, symbolically, the sins of the nation is put onto this animal, and then this animal is led out into the wilderness. It says, interestingly, by a fit man. So in other words, go far. And it also sends to a land that is cut off. So not this land, not Israel, not the land that Father has given to his people. Take it to a land that is not for them. It goes outside the land. So, but there's this principle then that's taught to us that sin or guilt can somehow be transferred. And this is starting to point to us. All these things obviously point towards a principle for Yeshua. So, it seems also, there's an aspect that's taught that the sinless, the one that is without guilt, because this animal does not have a choice. It doesn't sin. So somehow the one that is sinless and guiltless has the capacity to then take on the guilt. Now that's again a spiritual principle that we need to take note of as we go through this discussion. So there's patterns that Father teaches us throughout Scripture. It's the principles of righteousness and sin, clean and unclean, life and death. So there's a problem, however, with this, and we know this, and Hebrews 9 especially touches on this as well. So, but in Hebrews 10 it says, instead these sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins, because it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. So it is as if these bulls and goats, the sacrifices, they fall short somehow. They are insufficient. They are ineffective permanently. They don't have a permanent solution, in other words. So every year, the Day of Atonement takes place. Sorry for that, I have to move this microphone a little bit around. Every year, there's this repeated cycle that Father gives in the Torah for the Day of Atonement. In the 7th month, on the 10th day, it's a special day that is set apart beyond all other days. The thing is, it has to be repeated, because it's not permanent. The effects of this is not permanent. The sins of the people recur. The atonement has to be made again. The question might be, why? Why is it not sufficient? Because maybe we pause there for a moment quickly. Just think about this for a moment. If we say Yeshua is the perfect sacrifice for sin, it is because he is sinless. If we only simply stop there, then it is a bit of an insufficient answer, because animals are also sinless. So there's something else. That's one of the things I want to highlight today. There's something else about Yeshua. There's something unique about Yeshua. If it was simply a matter of innocence being sufficient, then animals should have been sufficient as well. Okay? So there's something else going on. Now, did I go backwards? Yes. One of the things I think that's important to highlight, we sang the song, Father, Change Our Hearts. And if we look at the Torah, we look at the story of Israel, we look at our lives even, we see that even them knowing the Torah, carrying the Torah with them, being taught the Torah, these are words that Father gave them. The living Almighty God speaks to people, and they hear these words, but does it change their hearts? That is the question. In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. And we see this in our own lives as well. Sometimes, sorry about that, sometimes we respond. Sometimes we have a change of heart in a way. and there's a change that happens, and we almost see the effect of life flowing out of that. But other times it's as if we fall back, take a step back, in essence. So it seems like the sacrifice of animals, it's not sufficient to change the heart of the sinner. So we spoke about that question. Why does the sin also affect the tabernacle and the altar? So that is one concept that I'd like you to take note of, what we've just spoken about. But there's another concept regarding sin, or principle, that we also need to touch on as part of this conversation. And I'm trying to get through this quite quickly because, as I say, I'd like to rather spend some time on the last slide. So there's the principle of the red heifer. And we have spoken about this so many times before. But in Numbers 19, you get this instruction by Father that says, find a perfect red heifer, take it outside the camp, burn it, everything, the whole thing, the whole animal. Burn outside the camp, and that ashes, mixed with clean water, is able to cleanse the unclean. So the unclean, in other words, takes a bit of you take a bit of these ashes, mix it with water, and when that water is sprinkled over an unclean one, anyone that has touched the body, any of those kinds of things that makes us unclean, then that person becomes clean. But it also says then that which was clean is now becoming unclean. So you have this effect where there's a transference. You've got the clean, you've got the unclean, and then it's transferred. Now, the problem may be then that if we just had enough supply of red heifers, then we would not have this problem of having to deal with atonement every time. Because, it's as if, if you look at the history, by the way, of the amount of red heifers that's taken or noted down in the history of the Jewish people, then of Israel, then you'll see there hasn't been many red heifers. There's some opinions, 7, 8, there's various opinions on how many. But the point is, there's a limited amount over the whole history, so they very preciously keep these ashes. But at some point, it runs out. Because when it runs out, it's done. You have to find another red heifer. Because these ashes can't be reused. Once it's unclean, it's unclean. So that is a bit of a problem. Now, in other words, what I'm saying is, well, maybe the solution might be then that there was an unlimited supply of red heifers, because then you could just solve this problem. But we obviously don't. So there must be another solution. So we need, in other words, a better cleaning agent. If you think about soap, it's interesting. I think I've got it on this slide. Yeah. Oops. Why is it jumping so much? If we think about soap for a moment, something that cleans, a cleaning agent. If you look at maybe you are aware of this. You've seen this before. But for those who haven't, it's quite interesting that, the sacrifices was, you've got wood that gets burnt. You've got animals, the fat of animals. There's water involved, all those things. And that's the recipe for making soap, something to clean. So, the ash, if you rinse, if you take water through it, you get lye. And that can be boiled with the fat of an animal, and that makes soap. That's something that can clean. So, the problem is, though, if you look at normal soap or any cleansing agent, typically, you take something that's dirty, you wash it. What happens? The water that you're washing with, the soap is now mixed with the water. You take that water, you wash your car. The water becomes dirty. Eventually, you can't use this dirty water to go wash an unlimited amount of cars, because the water, the soap, becomes dirty. It remains unclean, or it becomes unclean effectively. So we need a soap, ideally. Imagine how wonderful it would be if we could have soap. I mean, Johan would be very happy if we could find soap that you could just use over and over and over and over, and it just never stops cleaning. It remains perfectly clean and pure and able to be reused. Imagine if we had some kind of soap like that. That would be, all the soap factories would go out of business, but anyway. So we need something like also, some perfect heavenly leaven, something that can spread its effect. So that cleans, that cleanses. So we need something that that can spread. As it cleans the unclean, it remains clean. It does not get changed by the effect of cleaning. So, typically, again, you think of soap, you use it and it changes the nature of the soap. It takes on the dirt and it changes its nature essentially. So we need something that does not change. And we need some kind of maybe like a bread that can give life and not death. Because if you look at the normal analogy of leaven that spreads through a loaf of bread, or the dough at least of bread, it spreads and multiplies. If that's a symbol or an analogy for sin, we need the opposite, but the same principle. We need something that can multiply its cleanness without changing, so that it can multiply and multiply and multiply and multiply, and it leads to life and not death. So, do we have a solution like that? So, this is where we come to this question. What is the difference between Yeshua and animal sacrifice? And again, before I even continue, a lot can be said about this. And it can get quite philosophical again. But simply, I just want to highlight a couple of things. And this is to not to lay the foundation of all kinds of doctrines. But there's an important principle that it's interesting to me that Yeshua says He is the bread of life. He is the bread of life. And we just said, if sin and leaven is an analogy of each other, Yeshua is the bread of life. So He has some kind of leaven in Him that gives life. Now, a point to note maybe quickly, one could say the issue with animals in terms of their sinlessness, even though it's been used historically and in the Torah given as a sacrifice for sin and atonement, it seems like sinlessness is not enough. Because if sinlessness was simply the only matter at question, then Yeshua's sinlessness would have been the same level of sufficiency as animals' sinlessness. Because if sinlessness was the thing, then that's fine. We've got the solution in animals. But it seems like it's not only that. It's not just the sinlessness. It might be, one might argue and say, well, maybe it's the willingness to lay down the life. I mean, because animals do not have a say in the matter, unfortunately. It seems very cruel. I mean, my one daughter, Michaela, she hates this idea. These poor animals. And I can sympathize. So you've got the situation where these animals, they don't choose to give their lives. But we know that Yeshua laid down His life willingly. No one took it from Him. He gave His life willingly. So there's something, sure. But there's another aspect. Even though animals do not sin, they are part of creation. They carry death. Then animals age, and they would die, and they do. So animals are part of creation, and remember, it says, death entered into creation. So creation carries some kind of taintedness. It carries death. It carries the mark of death. Now the question then would be, and this could be a bit of a showstopper to this thinking process, but let's go through this. So we know that Yeshua put on sinful flesh. I mean, it sounds funny, but that's what Scripture says. The Word of God became flesh in the form of sinful man. So in the form of sinful flesh. If, just for argument's sake, if you think this through, I mean, he was a small boy, he was a baby, a small boy, he grew older. What would have happened if he was not killed? What would have happened if he did not die of some disease? Well, he would have grown older. And like everyone else, his flesh would have died. He carried sinful flesh. But is he simply just flesh? No. Are we just simply flesh? No. But there's another aspect that we quickly need to touch on, and that is the corrosiveness of sin. It seems like sin, if you think about an acid, or even rust, perhaps rust is a better way to look at this. So rust is an oxidation of metal. So it's a chemical reaction. So you've got a metal, like iron, let's say, and it interacts with oxygen in the air, and it forms iron oxide. So that is the red rust that we see, or the orange rust. So it changes the actual nature of the metal. The metal, iron, gets changed by the oxygen in the process of rusting or oxidizing. And when this happens, it creates pits and valleys and areas for more corrosiveness to enter. And as it proceeds over time, the whole part of iron would be transformed and be turned to rust as it gets exposed to more and more oxygen. So that is a process of corrosiveness over time. And it seems like sin is very much like that. It seems like when it affects creation, when it affects us, it has a way of creeping in all kinds of crevices and areas, and when it gets there, it's as if it causes more death, more spreading of more sin. One small sin leads to a bigger sin, and that bigger sin leads to a more bigger sin, and so the process goes on. So we know this from our own lives, we see this in the world, in creation. So, this thing jumps around quite a bit. One thing that is interesting, and a word almost that I want to quickly highlight, is the word cling to. So, when this corrosion happens, when this oxidization happens, when sin multiplies, it's as if it creates holding places to cling to. So in other words, death has a holding place, because when you see the word sin, you should see the same idea of death. So death as a way of clinging to what it corroded into. Okay, you get this idea. So in other words, creation has been changed and transformed by sin. Creation is not the same. It needs to be restored. And we know that Colossians 1, for example, speaks of how Yeshua is the one that will restore unto favor all things that has been created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. All things created will be restored because of him. So, but if something needs to be restored, it tells us that it's in need of restoration. It's been changed. It's deteriorated. Now, one important aspect then, is that we know that Yeshua does not change. So creation may change. Creation has been changed. But something that's unique about Yeshua, this is where we're getting to it now, is that Yeshua does not change. So he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He's the Word of God from the beginning. If he was the same then, perfect, unblemished, untainted by sin, uncreated. I mean, he is the one that has created everything. By him, everything has been formed. In him, all hold together. So, he is the same then. He's the same today and in the future. In other words, when he takes on sin, when sin gets into contact with him. Remember, Yeshua walked around and he would touch the unclean. He would touch the lepers. And the lepers would be cleansed. What would happen to him? Richly, he would become unclean. He would not be able to go to the tabernacle. He would not be able to go to the temple, actually, in his day. But then he would have to go through a process of cleansing. But this sounds strange to us, because we have typically an association of unclean with sin. We think unclean equals sin. It's not the same thing. Unclean, tahor in Hebrew, is ritual impurity. It's ritual unfitness, or you don't have the right to go to the tabernacle before Father's presence if you are unclean. But that does not necessarily mean sinful. So when Yeshua touched sin or touched a leper, the uncleanness would be transferred to him, but then it doesn't mean he is sinful. He just takes it upon himself, but it does not change him, because he does not change. So remember that I said, death clings to sin. So sin and death go together. Now, Yeshua is sinless, yes, animals too, but creation was changed by taking on sin. For example, if we look at the red heifer, the principle of the ash and the water, the clean, or that which is clean can transfer its cleanness to that which is unclean, but then it itself becomes unclean. And we know that is an example of what we see in creation. We see this in the red heifer, for example. But even though Yeshua's flesh died, he is not simply flesh. He is the Word of God that took on flesh, right? So, when Yeshua rose from death, we just came through Passover now. We just came through the feast of unleavened bread that speaks of his time in the grave and his resurrection, first fruits and all those beautiful connections. When he rose from death, death could not hold on to him. And what was that word that I said? Just remember that word, cling. So, death could not cling to him. It does not have a holding place. So he remains clean, and therefore he is able to keep cleansing. And just as a final thought perhaps on this, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it is an interesting thought that I think is maybe worth mentioning quickly. When Yeshua rose from the grave, he rose from death, where did that death go? Where did it, maybe you could say it another way, where did the death stay that he took upon himself? Well, it stayed in the grave. He stood up out of the grave. Death doesn't follow him wherever he goes. He's life. So death stays in the grave, there where he stood out of. Now, that's very small. I quickly want to read that verse in Revelation 20, verse 14. So it says, "Then death and Hades." Now remember that Hades is the Greek word for the grave or the place of the dead. But in Hebrew, the idea is Sheol. So the place of the dead. There where death is. There it's an unknown, dark, non-conscious place. Even though the Greek mythologies have another story. But that death and the grave. Note, it says death and the grave. Hades, Sheol. Both of them, they are two separate things. They will also be cast into the lake of fire, and ultimately they will be destroyed. They won't exist anymore. Okay, let's move on. So, it's a bit small there, but as I was preparing and praying through this, I just got a bit of a picture that made me help me to understand or think maybe through this process of this cleaning process. And I quickly want to share this with you. And what I simply in this picture saw was I could say it's two marbles. So, or think to it as two particles. So just like leaven is a very microscopic particle, actually it's very, very small. So think of two particles, maybe an easy way is these two marbles. And the one marble is white, shining brightly. The marble next to it is black, and it's full of black ink. It got dirty. So you can't really see underneath, but it used to be a white marble, but somehow it carries this darkness on it. And then this white marble touches this black ink marble and takes on the black ink onto itself. And then this black marble now turns into a white marble, gets cleansed. But now this previously white marble that was shining brightly also is now covered by this darkness. And then imagine that through this, in this marble, you start seeing light shining through cracks in this blackness. And as that light shines, it starts to dry off, and dry off this ink, and this ink falls off this marble. And this black ink represents obviously death. So this death falls off this marble, again showing its pure whiteness. Its being was not changed. It remains unchanged, even though it took on this blackness, this darkness, this death. But it did not change the marble. And so this marble has now caused this other marble to be cleansed, but now it is still pure and clean and shining. And then what can it do? It can do the same to another one. It can keep on doing this process forever and ever and ever. And that process started, we can say maybe in our timelines, maybe roughly 2,000 years ago. And it's been a process that's been going on since then. People's lives have been changed and transformed, but it's still an ongoing process. And this process will continue until all has been restored, as Colossians 1 says. Now, if this death that fell off Yeshua, that falls off this white marble, essentially, this blackness, this darkness, that if it falls off, Where is it now? We say it is in the grave. So what will happen to it? Will it be forever there to remind us, to mock us? I think this is one of those slides that I thought maybe I should take out, actually, now I think about this. But, we said, death will ultimately be cast. Death and the grave will be cast into the lake of fire. It will be destroyed. It will not be there forever to mock us, to haunt us, to remind us. So it's a good hope to also to remember. All right. This is actually where I wanted to pause and quickly actually summarize. All that we've said this morning, I quickly tried to rush through because I actually wanted to get to these 3 points. And they're actually stories. And they are stories that you've probably heard and that you know of, and you might be familiar with that. But it's all about, again, what I said in the beginning. Every year we go through this process of Pesach. We do inward reflection. We go through unleavened bread. And we just go on with our lives. And if we are not careful, it's the same pattern. How many times do we have to go through this pattern and not be changed? How many times do we need to go through this process to be reminded, sort your life out, go up to another level? Almost like I want to say, let's get up to the next level. Let's go to the next notch. And so it's an encouragement because Father is, as I said also in the beginning, busy in this world. The world is getting dark, yes, but the light is also growing brighter. He is currently busy and he's calling things into alignment. He's calling things into another level of seriousness or depth, or I would even say intimacy. So these 3 stories, even though they might be simple stories, they do tell, it's very much like parables. It's meant to convey a spiritual truth. And maybe, as I say, you may have heard these kinds of stories before, but the point of this is to go through these to show you something, I hope, that will help you for the next year. So that next year, when you get to Pesach, that you might say, this year has been a year where there has been change in my life, where I've grown, where I've been able to put things down and not pick them up again, things that I should not have been carrying. So, there is this, wait, before I do that, there's this whole thing of, this misunderstanding perhaps of when Yeshua was crucified, some may be understanding it as, he took the whole law and that was nailed to the cross. But in actual fact, what it's actually saying is the fines, the penalties that were due to us because of the law. So the law could be, maybe an analogy for that could be, let's say, the traffic laws. So the traffic laws are there for a purpose. They are there to control traffic, to create order, so that life can be preserved, so that when you are in your car and driving in a neighborhood, that you are not going to drive at 200 kilometers per hour, so that when a child runs across the street, you have enough time to brake, to see the child. So the speed limit says drive at 60 when you're in a neighborhood. It's meant to preserve life. It's meant for goodness. So the law is there for good in this case. Now think of that as Father's laws as well that He gives to us. He gives these laws for us, for our well-being, for our life, for good. Okay, His intentions and will through this is good. But then there are consequences. So if you are speeding in a neighborhood and someone catches you driving, let's say 90 kilometers per hour, then you deserve a ticket. And simple. And you will then get this ticket. And it might be a 500 Rand ticket, it might be a 1,000 Rand ticket, I don't know. But the point is, let's say you keep doing this, eventually you will accrue a massive amount of speeding fines. And maybe you are not aware perhaps, but maybe there's cameras that are watching every little move that you make, and you thought these little laws that you break are not taken note of, but maybe somewhere it's written down, and there's this massive debt of speeding fines and all kinds of penalties that's accruing, and you're not aware of this, and it's building up, and one day you're called before the judge, and that you get a letter in the post that says you need to appear in court. And you appear in court, and the judge says, "Are you Christian?" "Yes." And he says, "Well, are you aware of all these things that's against your name?" And I might go, "Well, no, sure, I can see some of these things where I'm guilty. These things I'm not even aware of. And some of these things I'm not even aware of." what must I do to get free? And then the judge says, well, it's like 300 billion, 412,000 million, 212,000, 11 to 11. And rands worth of fines. And I would say, well, I don't have the money to pay this. I fall short. I cannot pay this amount. It's impossible for me. What is the other option? Well, you'll have to be thrown in jail until you work this off. No, how do you work this off? You're in jail. But anyway, so you've got a problem. So now, in that moment, and again, as I say, this is a story you may have heard so many times, but for those who haven't. So at that moment, when you are in despair, when you realize, I'm in trouble, I cannot save myself, I cannot do anything else, the son of the judge walks in and says, Dad, just a comment, may I quickly approach the bench, or whatever you call it? May I quickly approach? The judge says, yes. Goes there. Son says to his father, I went and I paid and I cleared all the fines against Christian's name. So the judge then says, well, Christian, good news. My son just told me he's actually covered all your fines. I don't know how you know him. I don't know why he's done this for you. But the law says that I can let you go because your fines are paid. So you're welcome to go. Now, that story was nothing. That's not the point. The point is actually to get to this. What is my reaction when I get into my car? So when I get into my car, I have two choices. The one is to say, man, all my fines have been paid. I can go speeding again. So that is the one reaction. And that would be a worldly, fleshly reaction. The proper reaction, I would say, would be where you go, you bow your head and you cry and you are thankful for what happened. And you realize the weight, what could have happened to you, what you deserved. And now what you do is you change your behavior. You change your actions because of what happened. It changes your heart. Okay? And now, it does not mean that you are perfect. So as you are driving around, you might be driving around in the neighborhood and maybe you are distracted. You change the volume on the radio, or maybe your phone rings and you look at it and you put off the phone or whatever, and you're distracted for a moment. And maybe you go 71 kilometers per hour in a 60 zone. Now in that, and I'm not trying to speak about obeying the land laws, I'm trying to paint a picture of a spiritual story. So when this happens and you realize your sin, your transgression, it should cause a reaction in you where you say, I made a mistake, I'm sorry, and you slack down. You change your behavior back. You correct it. You teshuvah. You turn around. You correct your behavior to fall into alignment with the law that leads to life. So that is the one story. That is one principle. And that is what we are called to. We are called to be changed by realizing what has been done for us. Okay, but we know this. We've heard this maybe for many years. But have we changed? Question. Then another one. In this week's Torah portion, there is, in Leviticus 18, a very difficult chapter actually, but speaking a lot about sexual immorality. And some of it seems to us in our culture, this sounds ridiculous, but this world, as it says there in Leviticus actually, this world lives like that. If you are not walking in and understanding and aware of God's laws, the things that's spoken of in Leviticus 18 is normal. It's horrendous, maybe to us, perhaps. But if we are honest, we are just as guilty in many other ways. Okay, so now there's this thing of sexual immorality. And I think one of the biggest challenges that the world faces, yes, but also within even the world of believers, even amongst us, is this thing of where there is transgression. In areas where there might be sexual immorality or transgression. Now, for that, that is a huge, huge topic. And it's a problem that is prevalent in the church at the moment. And I know some people would say we are not the church, but we are. We are part of God's assembly. So let's just leave it at that for a moment. Let's go towards the thing that we maybe don't realize is the severity of this. And now, let me quickly tell a story again to highlight the thinking that should be an example for us. So we know the story of Joseph. It's in Genesis 39. And Genesis 39 tells of how Joseph was sold into Egypt, and he goes to work, or gets sold to Potiphar. And you know the story of Potiphar's wife and that whole thing. But there comes a point where she says to him, lie with me, and he says, no, I will not do these things. Because, why? Well, Potiphar has put me in charge of all these things, he's given me all this authority, and but he's withheld you from me because you are his wife. And then he says something interesting. He says, how then can I sin and transgress against God? So there's two aspects to his answer. There's two things that he's looking at. And I mean, for me, for many years, I've not seen this. But it's interesting because he speaks of Potiphar and what Potiphar has entrusted to him. And then he says, I cannot go, essentially, I can't break his trust. Potiphar is trusting me with these things. How can I break this trust and sin against God? There are two things. It's a way of thinking. Okay, now, this leads me actually into the last story. And that is actually a very weighty story. But it links up to this one with Joseph that I mentioned. And this is meant to encourage us to go to the next level. It has helped me. So there's the story of this father and son that goes camping together. And so they arrive and they set up the camp. They get their tent set up, they get out all their fishing rods, and because they want to go fish together, they want to spend some time together. And so they are really excited to have this weekend together where they can go and catch some fish and so on. And but the dad says to his son, "Son, I love you. I want to spend this time with you, and we are going to fish together. But one thing I just want to make you aware of is this river that we are going to fish in. It's full of massive crocodiles. There's a lot of fish, huge fish, and that's why there's so many crocodiles. But there are crocodiles in this river, and you can't just stand on the bank of this river. And there's a little boat even. Don't go in this boat to go on the water to catch the crocodiles. There's a wall that you can stand on that's highly elevated from the water that both of us, we can stand safely on this wall. We would be away from the crocodiles. They can't reach us, and then we can stand there together and we can cast our lines and fish together. It would be wonderful. But please don't go in the water." And they do this and they catch fish, and the dad goes, after a couple of hours of fishing, he's tired and he wants to go take a nap. And the son thinks to himself, man, it must be quite exciting actually to be there in the midst of those crocodiles. I mean, it sounds a little bit scary and so on, but it could be quite an adventure. I mean, I'd be careful. I would climb in the boat. I won't rock the boat. I'll sit in the boat. I won't stand. I'll sit in the boat, and then I'll just row out slowly, and then I'll cast my line, and it would be quite an adventure. And then I can tell this huge story, and maybe my dad might be proud of me of how brave I was actually. And so the son goes out in the water, and he catches hooks a fish. And in this busyness in the water, the crocodiles start moving about, and there's this huge crocodile and knocks over the boat. And the son falls into the water and starts screaming, obviously, for his life. And the dad wakes up, realizes what's going on. He hears the son, he sees the splashing around. He, without thinking or any concern of his own life or safety, he runs into this water and he swims, gets his son, puts him in the boat, kind of swims to the side of the river. They're out of the water, and the boy looks at his dad, and his dad is like terribly, terribly injured from the crocodiles that got him. And he's bleeding, and he's been ripped, and it's quite bad. And so the son looks at his dad, and now this is where I want you to maybe just hear me. Think about us in our. We know Yeshua, he died for our sins. We know he took the punishment upon himself that we deserved. We've gone through, we look at the movie of, what's it? The Passion. So we look at that and we see how he gets whipped. We see how he gets tortured, and as he gets whipped, they think they've done it, they've crushed him, they've broken him, and then as they turn around, he gets up again and says, no, bring more. And so we see that, and when I looked at that, I cried, and I just felt, wow, you see the weight of the effect of my sin, the effect of our sin that he took. So we know this thing, but it's, in a way, it's distant. It can be distant. It can be something that we are aware of and say, thank you, Yeshua. And then we turn around, and what then? So there's the son, and he looks at his dad and says, oh, Dad, thank you so much for saving my life. If it wasn't for you, I would have been eaten by those crocodiles. I see you are in tremendous pain at the moment, but I'm sure you wouldn't mind if I took the boat out again to go fish amongst the crocodiles. Now, it sounds insane. It sounds crazy to even think such a thought. What I would almost say, what blasphemy. But isn't that very much something that should tell us how we often treat our Father, how we treat Yeshua? He has paid this ultimate sacrifice. Yes, he is the perfect cleaning agent. Yes, he is, we can make it very theological. He goes into the heavenly tabernacle with his blood and atones for us, intercedes for us between the Father. And we can make it very theological, and it's an intellectual thing. And sometimes we may even get a little bit emotional about it for a time. But I want to encourage you maybe next time when you're in a spot where your flesh wants to go in one way and in your spirit you should go that way. Maybe think about that thought. Think about the Father that gave his Son life by rescuing him from those crocodiles. And then the Son saying to his dad, oh, you wouldn't mind if I got into the river again to swim amongst those crocodiles, or to go with a boat and fish amongst the crocodiles? We would say now that sounds ridiculous, but in that moment, if we would choose the way of the flesh again against the way of the Spirit, the one that Father says, if we keep doing that, that is exactly how we are acting. We are acting like the Son that does that to his Father. And so it sounds heavy, it sounds intense, but I want to highlight the weight of this to you. And so, yes, Yeshua is the perfect cleansing agent. He is the perfect high priest also. In the Levitical system, that high priest of that day had to sacrifice a bull, had to sacrifice a ram for his atonement, for his family's atonement, for the atonement of the people. And now in Yeshua, he is the perfect atonement. And we can, again, as I say, make this very intellectual, very doctrinal, very theological. But for a moment, think that he is set apart. He is not like that. He is at a different level. And he's calling us up to a different level. He's saying to us again, after this Pesach, after this unleavened bread, don't go back into the same patterns. Don't go back to those things that may hold you and grip you, that are like shackles around your feet. They are invisible chains that leads to death. Don't go back to those things. Don't yearn for the leeks and the onions and the garlic and the fish of Egypt. Now trust me as I take you through the wilderness, because I'm taking you to a beautiful land. Trust me, walk with me, hold on to me, don't turn back. And we're not turning back only in our actions. We also turn back in our hearts so easily. And so he's calling us to say, I'm calling things, Father is calling things into alignment, and we are part of that. He's wanting us to come in line and walk with him. And so that's an encouraging thought in a way, that the creator of the universe has made a plan, he's implemented this plan, and then he's inviting us and saying, join me, walk with me, go up to another level. Don't be like the world, be set apart. Are there any questions or thoughts from your side that you'd like to share or say? My side is done. Yes. Wonderful that we've been singing, Let Me Be Like You. Yes. And I think, one thing I was thinking of when we were singing, is again how easy it is for us to say things. We sing songs, we say things. When we are with friends or with other believers, we act a certain way. The challenge, obviously, for us is when we are not here, when we are not surrounded by beauty and goodness and righteousness, when we are in the world. That is when it gets maybe a little bit tougher. But in those moments, when you are at the point when you need to choose, do I turn left or do I turn right? Do I choose to death or do I choose life? Remember maybe this story of how can you be like that son that says to his father, thanks for fighting off the crocodiles and letting your legs be ripped up and torn to pieces. But yeah, it will be fun to go maybe fish amongst those crocodiles. Let's not be like that son. Let us be like Joseph, that realizes that Father has entrusted us with a lot. And he will hold us accountable for a lot. Is that, maybe now a reminder is that verse, I can't remember now exactly, but it basically essentially says, the servant who knows the will of the master and does not do it will receive many lashings. But the servant who does not know and yet does what deserves a lashing will get a lashing. But the one who has been given a lot will be accounted from them, or required from them. So that is maybe where we are. So we may think that we are clever. We think we are very, spiritual. We have arrived. But maybe let us be humble and remember, maybe with this, what Father has given us, whatever He's shown us, whatever He's taught us, let us honor that. He's entrusted us with lots. And so let's honor that and not sin against Him. Any other comments or thoughts? You want to quickly bring the microphone?
Possibly we are like that son that didn't see the danger, the way to the danger that he was going to put himself into. But it was the fish that were the big fish were the ones that were out there. And it was more that's greed or something else is attracting us.
The desire of the fish.
The desire to go and get that. And we don't actually look at the danger of what it's going to put us into.
Or others.
And others, yes.
Right, I think let's end it there. Our Heavenly Father, we thank You that You are reminding us that You are set apart. You are not like the world. Your ways are not like the ways of the world. And Father, You are calling us to a higher place spiritually. You are calling us up out of this world. You are calling us up out of death. You are inviting us into life and goodness. And Father, thank You that You are faithful, that You have not left us. You have not left us where we deserved to have been left. Father, You have reached out Your hand and You've given us a hope. And as we take hold of Your hand, Father, may we be lifted up out of the miry clay. Father, may we be cleansed and renewed. Father, change and renew our hearts, our thinking. And Father, this is all done because of Your goodness. You do this out of love towards us. And this is a choice and an opportunity that You give to each one. And so, Father, may Your Spirit move. May Your Spirit touch us. May Your Spirit strengthen us and renew us. May Your Spirit remind us of what You have taught us. And Father, may we stand strong as we walk through this world. And Father, may we give You glory in everything we do. Father, thank You that You are with us, that You are for us and not against us. Father, I pray that You will bless each one in this congregation that has visited us, that's part of us, that will maybe listen in. Father, bless each one that whose hearts yearn for You, whose hearts are one with you, or at least want to be. Father, bless them and draw them in. May they know your goodness. May they know your hand on their lives. We thank you, Father, and thank you, Yeshua. Amen.